Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I want to welcome you to the last event of the academic year. And we are ending our program for the year on a very high note. We are very happy to have Dr. Isaac McKean Scarborough with us. Isaac has last year published a wonderful book, and I can show it to you here. Moscow's Heavy Shadow: The Violent Collapse of the USSR, and it is an account of the descent of Soviet Tajikistan and post-Soviet Tajikistan in a civil war. It is a beautiful book, a labor of love, drawing on decades of research inside Tajikistan, outside Tajikistan, and it very nicely combines the big picture and structural factors, and also deeply personal accounts. And there is even poetry inside. I very much like the little poems at the beginning of each chapter. It's a highly enjoyable book, and I think Leora and me, and by the way, Leora Eisenberg, is my partner in crime in this undertaking, and not only this undertaking, she will be co-moderating this session. And Leora is a PhD student in history here at Harvard University. So both Leora and me highly recommend to acquire this book, and we will share the discount code. Actually, you can find the code in the comments, and we'll be posting it again. But without further ado, let me introduce the author, and then give the floor to Isaac to present his book. Isaac McKean Scarborough is assistant professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies in the Institute for History at Leiden University. He studies post-war Soviet and post-Soviet economic and social development in Central Asia, Russia, and Ukraine. And and he's the author of this book. So without further ado, Isaac, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nargis, for that very warm and positive introduction, and to you and to Leora for organizing this talk, and to the Davis Center at Harvard University for the opportunity to speak a little bit about the research that I've done and the book that was a product of it. I really do appreciate this quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to the discussion as well that may come out of it. I have a bit of a presentation to share, so I'd like to put that up on the screen as well. So as Nargis said, the book that I've published is called Moscow's Heavy Shadow: The Violent Collapse of the USSR. In large part, this is a book that takes place in Tajikistan, in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, in some of the cities in the south of Tajikistan, and in some of the other parts of the country. But it's also a book that makes claim in part to a reevaluation of the collapse of the USSR as a time not necessarily full of democracy or hope or positive change for everyone involved, but for many of those who experienced it, a time of violence and destruction and sadly death. And this is sadly a reorientation that I think is necessary to make, but one that changes also how we see the collapse and how we see the aftermath of the collapse, including in Tajikistan. What I wanted to do today is to provide a little bit of a narrative to start with, and this is the narrative that starts the book, and to talk a little bit about why that individual narrative then gives us a broader perspective. And then I want to use that as a lens to branch out into three larger claims that emerge from the book about the nature of the Soviet collapse and its consequences. The first one has to do with the economic nature and the economic focus that I have emphasized in my book. The second is the endemic nature of violence in the collapse that comes out of that across the USSR, I argue, not only in Tajikistan. And third, a sort of broader abstraction to reconsider the nature of late Soviet society and politics from the perspective of the ways that the USSR collapsed in varying levels of violence and destruction. So that's what I hope to do very briefly today as an introduction to the book and some of the major themes. But we start, as I said, with one individual, and this is a man named Qadruddin Aslonov, who dies in December 1992. And he dies in captivity in a kolkhoz in the south of Tajikistan, where he had been held for 2 months in October 1992. He's given the opportunity to call his family at the beginning of December, and then he's shot by his captors. And he had been captured in October 1992 because he had been sent by the then government in Dushanbe, which was a government made up of what were then thought of as opposition figures, but they controlled at the time the capital, to negotiate with the breakaway province Koyo in the south of the country. Aslonov never made it to meet with the people he was supposed to. He was captured, he was held. The individual he was supposed to meet with had also been shot by the same group of people that then killed him in December. For Aslonov, this was the end of a political career that had started in the 1970s and the 1980s. In the 1970s and the 80s, he was known as a charismatic, handsome politician. He was rising quickly through the ranks of the Communist Party of Tajikistan. By the 1980s, he was a secretary of the Communist Party and a deputy to Kahor Maqam of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Tajikistan. By November 1990, he became the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Tajik Republic when Kahor Maqamov became president during the changes enacted during Perestroika. And yet in 1991, he was forced out by angry crowds and protesters. And in 1992, as a representative trying to create some sort of semblance of order in the middle of a civil war, he was killed. And Aslonov was only one of tens of thousands of people who were killed in Tajikistan, and one of the tens of thousands of people whose lives were brought short and whose entire world was turned upside down and who lost the order of their lives during Perestroika and then the civil war in Tajikistan that followed it. So he is not alone. He's a well-known figure. He's someone we can focus on. But what he represents in many ways and the experience that he underwent between, let's say, 1985 and 1992 is an experience, in fact, that I want to argue was quite representative of what many people in Tajikistan experienced. And it was representative even more so of what many people across the entirety of the USSR also experienced in one degree or another, although thankfully the majority of them did not meet a fate as harsh as Aslonov's. So what I want to do in essence, and what I've tried to do in my book in part, is to take examples like Aslonov's and to abstract outward and to consider what they mean for our understanding of the period of Perestroika and what they mean for our understanding of the collapse of the USSR and its consequences. But partly what this requires is that we reconceptualize how we deal with Soviet history and how we think of the center and the periphery in Soviet history. The vast majority of histories of the Soviet collapse and actually of Soviet processes in general tend to focus on Moscow. They might also look at Leningrad, they might also look at Kiev, they might look at Novosibirsk, but they're looking at major urban, essentially Russian cities in which things like economic programs, reform ideas, academic discussions, intellectual foment is happening. These then create programs that are implemented across the whole of the USSR in many, many peripheries, not in Tajikistan alone. But we don't hear the history of the USSR from the implementation of those programs. We don't hear the USSR from the history of the USSR from the perspective of the actual consequences of programs. What we hear are then two bifurcating histories, the history of how things are discussed and implemented in Moscow, which is taken as representative for the whole, and then peripheral histories, the history of Tajikistan in the 30s, the history of Kazakhstan, let's say, in the 1970s. But the history of Kazakhstan in the 1970s or the history of Tajikistan in the 1930s or the history of the Soviet collapse in Central Asia is not taken as the Soviet history as a whole. The Soviet history as a whole is coming from Moscow. We are still orienting around narratives that come from the center. But by focusing exclusively on these narratives from the center, we don't actually see a great deal of the consequence, and we don't see the ways that the USSR is changing and becoming something different over the decades in many ways that are not always obvious in Moscow. One of the fascinating things I found in my research was, in fact, Moscow had little idea what was going on in Tajikistan a lot of the time. The people who were supposed to be in charge of political parties when they were being developed in the last years of Perestroika, or the Communist Party, or various economic enterprises in Tajikistan, had very little concrete knowledge. And so their conception of what the USSR was and how it was operating is also quite biased and incorrect. And so we need to sort of reorient ourselves away from center exclusive narratives and to focus as much as what's going on in the periphery and in focus on the periphery to understand what was going on and what was happening as a whole. So we don't want to tell the history of Tajikistan as the history only of Tajikistan in the Soviet period. We want to understand Tajikistan's collapse into civil war as part of the broader collapse of the USSR. And we can do this, I hope, by focusing specifically on the facts of the collapse, the consequences, and how they were then connected to the programs that are initiated in Moscow. Through this research project, a lot of what I then ended up focusing on is, in fact, the economic reform program. And I did that because it had the most immediate and strongly felt consequences in places like Tajikistan. And as I argue in the book, it leads as much as anything to the breakdown of social order, which then becomes a political conflict and a violent conflict by 1992. How does this happen? Well, in part, it happens because this previous order of economic regulation between enterprises and between republics breaks down. There are a well-known series of reforms that are enacted between 1986 and 1989 in Moscow, but essentially what they do is they allow both enterprises, that is Soviet industrial objects, to start acting partially like private enterprise, and they allow the legal foundation and operation of private businesses under the name of cooperatives. The combination of these things together creates a massive profit motive. It creates the motivation for enterprises not to produce goods that are needed by the population, but in fact the goods that can be sold for the highest profits. These are so-called prestige goods. They're higher price point goods. They're goods that just have a higher price but are labeled somehow differently to justify it under the Soviet pricing system. And this is possible to do as an enterprise once you label yourself, quote unquote, hozurashotnaya, which is to say self-financing. And I have a number of examples in the book, but one of the most obvious and interesting, I think, is that of Tajik Atlas, which was a well-known and profitable producer of clothing and cloth, primarily of silk cloth, based in Dushanbe. And I was looking at the tax records for this enterprise, and you can see that by the time that it declares itself hozurashotnaya, the self-financing, as of January 1st, 1989, that its profit structure changes, that its profits go up, that the majority of the profits are now retained by the enterprise, and that its emphasis is quickly on producing more expensive goods rather than more goods, which we can see if we look at the turnover tax, which is essentially a proxy for the volume of goods produced rather than the total price of those goods. We know the total price went up, but that it's less goods being produced and more profits being retained by the enterprise. This, in practice, in an aggregate form, both in places like Tajikistan and across the USSR, essentially means that there are less goods available for people to buy. We know this is happening exactly at the same time that there's inflation. We also know that there's increasing unemployment. And in places like Tajikistan, this unemployment reaches 30%. By 1990 and 1991, if not higher. We know it's also at a time that there's a great bifurcation in incomes between those who are taking advantage of the new reforms and those who haven't been able to. So we have, by 1989, a recession. This increases in scale by 1990 and 1991. And we have a essentially cascade of reforms on top of reforms, all of which are implemented, all of which are being embraced by the absolute vast majority of the enterprises in the USSR. And as a result, these reforms lead very much directly to economic collapse by 1991, and a situation that by late 1991 and early 1992 is essentially unsustainable. And it's unsustainable because there are too many people who don't have jobs, who are unable to buy goods for their families, who are completely bereft in a situation that years before, and not that many years before, had seemed exceedingly stable. I think sadly, previously, we haven't heard from many of the people who were the real losers in the economic calculus of perestroika, the people who found their livelihoods disappearing, who found that they were no longer able to feed their families. These are voices that we don't hear because we're focused on the people who are designing reforms and the ones who think that the reform project whether or not it led to the right consequences were essentially well-minded, and this is what we focus on. But if we listen to the people, for example, in Tajikistan, we get individuals like Mirzo Khakimov, who was a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, who had returned as kolkhoz in the late 1980s, and who had found it relatively stable until the reforms of perestroika had completely destabilized the economic order. And he found by 1992 that he was no longer able to buy, as he says, pretty coats, but he's also no longer able to feed his family. He largely does not have the money, given rampant inflation, given the rising prices, given the lack of goods, to provide for his family. So he is one of the people who protests on the streets of Dushanbe in 1992. He's also an individual who then, as far as I know, later goes on to fight on behalf of the parties that engage in violence from May 1992. And he does so specifically, and he protests and demonstrates and has explicitly stated this, that he did so because of economic reasons. And overwhelmingly, the connection is both in the archival materials, the oral histories, and the other evidence that I have found, that people engage in political protest, they engage in political fomentation, and ultimately they engage in political violence in the context of late Soviet and early post-Soviet Tajikistan, because they no longer believe that the order is providing the material goods and benefits and the sense of stability that it once did. They are lacking the sense that their lives and their children's lives will be better in a way that they had long believed. And this then makes them easily mobilized by populist politicians who arrive on the scene after 1989 and 1990. So we know that the populist politicians in Tajikistan include people from a wide variety of political backgrounds. We have individuals who are promoting national and cultural as well as economic independence. These are the people like Tohir Abdul-Jabbar and Rastakhez. There are individuals who are promoting a return to conservative values of Islam in the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. There are those like Shodman Yusuf from the Democratic Party that have a bit more of a pro-perestroika or pro-democracy line, but all of them are essentially and openly stating that the Soviet system in Tajikistan is no longer working and it is necessary to turn to something else. And this leads to the violence that we see in Tajikistan from March 1992. It becomes open warfare by May 1992. It moves south initially from Dushanbe to the southern provinces of Kurkantube and Kulob, where the majority of violence occurs between June and October 1992. By November and December 1992, the forces from Kulob are able to overrun those in Dushanbe, retake the capital, and then continue to fight the civil war formally until 1997, although we know very well that the violence continues for many years thereafter. We still don't have a good estimate of the number of people that died, but it ranges generally between 20,000 and 50,000. The level of destruction and violence between May and November 1992 is overwhelming. However, the vast majority of casualties occurred in this period. The vast amount of depravity and violence on a low level is also occurring in this period. And it's still a horrifying experience for many of the people who underwent it. We don't really have a good accounting of many of those months or of the years of civil war as of yet. But we can see that this is a process that came out of the Soviet collapse, that this is something that was not divergent from the economic reforms that preceded it, the period of social and political disorder that preceded it, but it is something that leads directly from it. So we have economic reforms destabilizing the system. We have political populism coming in to take advantage of that. And we have that populism in the context of a political and military vacuum, essentially becoming civil war. But this is not an experience of violence, I want to argue, that is exclusive to Tajikistan. Tajikistan has at the time the largest, bloodiest, and lengthiest civil war, at least in 1992. Arguably, the war in Chechnya is probably a more destructive and bloodier example that comes out of the collapse of the USSR, but certainly in 1992-93, this may be one of the bloodiest and worst, but it is not the only example by any means of political violence. There are examples throughout perestroika in places like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, in Abkhazia and Ossetia, Southern Ossetia and Georgia. We know in Moldova there are examples of violence. There's also violent protests in Minsk, for example, in 1990 that we don't know very much about at all. And that have largely been repressed in the historical record. In Kazakhstan, there are examples of violence, unfortunately, in perestroika and that may or may not be directly related to the same processes, but we can see a sort of frustration billowing out across many elements and many parts of the USSR in the period. And this, in fact, is a spectrum of violence that I think we need to pay more close attention to as something related to the USSR's collapse as a whole, not related to the specificities of the places necessarily where violence occurs, because violence is occurring in so many places, but in fact related to the commonalities of the experience of Soviet collapse. The Soviet collapse in the final years of the USSR and the years immediately after the formal end of the USSR in December 1991 are consistent throughout the former or across the Soviet and post-Soviet space in terms of the economic reforms. They're consistent in terms of the economic collapse that came in the final years of the economic recession. They're very consistent in terms of the social disorder and political vacuum that they created. So this connection between processes that are constant across the USSR and a spectrum of violence that comes from the outcomes of these processes are also at the heart of my book. And it's something that I want to argue that this is a consistent element of the Soviet collapse, that it is not something specific to Tajikistan. We hear very frequently that the war might have happened in Tajikistan because of religion or because of disagreements over the place of religion in society. There have been arguments that it has to do with the local cultural norms and ways that men in Tajikistan socialize. There are arguments about the particular influence of cotton as a sort of immobile good that is hard to take advantage of without controlling territory as an influential factor for the Civil War. All of these may be elements, but these are things that focus specifically on Tajikistan and Tajikistan as a sort of ahistorical place outside of the context of the last years of the USSR and the first years thereafter, which is to say outside of the context in which violence occurs. And I really cannot emphasize enough that it's important to return the Tajik Civil War and return the violence across the whole of the USSR to the context in which it did occur, which is to say the reforms of the final years of the USSR under Mikhail Gorbachev and the consequences that they brought about. But I think we can also make one final larger abstraction from this idea of a spectrum of outcomes occurring across a constancy of reform and collapse, which is that things do happen differently in different contexts. We know that the Tajik Civil War is a vastly different creature, if you want, or it's a vastly different scale of violence than we would see in Uzbekistan at the time, or that what we see elsewhere in Central Asia or elsewhere in the USSR. We know that violence is occurring in particular regions and particular locations with a particular level of extremity, and there is less extremity in other differences. So we have, I want to say, a consistency of outcome, but it's a consistency of outcome that varies many different ways. And this also represents the fact that although all of these contexts, Tajikistan included, are very much part of the Soviet Union, they're very much part of the Soviet space, they all differ quite radically. They differ quite radically in terms of their particular economic superstructure, the particular commodities that may be emphasized, the particular levels of industrialization. They also differ in terms of political culture. If you look at the political culture specifically, rather than say underlying historical or traditional culture, but the culture that developed within the Communist Party in Tajikistan, it's quite different than the Communist Party, even of other Central Asian republics. It's certainly very different in terms of the way that people within the Communist Party of Tajikistan interacted than, for example, the way that Communist Party secretaries in Moscow interacted with one another. One of the fascinating things that I found in interviews is how party and government workers from Tajikistan would talk about their interactions with Moscow workers or their interactions with people who would come from the Central Party Committee or the Central Committee, the Communist Party of the USSR in Moscow to visit Tajikistan, and how socially there was a great gap in the ways that they were operating, not only in terms of the fact that, say, the people coming from the Central Committee had little idea what was going on in Tajikistan, but in fact that they couldn't find a common language to socially interact with one. And actually, this creates this fascinating sense of heterogeneity and multitudinous of the late Soviet experience. Tajikistan in the 80s is very much part of the USSR. It's very much integrated and engaged in the Soviet project. But it is still very much its own republic. It's very much its own political culture that differs also from, say, Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or the other republics around it. And actually, by abstracting outward to look at the consistency of violence that comes from the collapse of the USSR, we can curiously also see the differences that preceded that collapse, and fascinatingly as well, the way that Moscow frequently overlooked them. So the final insight here may be that the reforms were implemented from Moscow based on Moscow programs that, on the one hand, assumed the entire USSR to be the same, and assumed that implementation would occur in a consistent and unified fashion across all of the republics. But we know in practice that wasn't the case. And we know in practice that they played out in many different ways. But because the reforms were implemented in different, although I want to argue many ways consistent, implementations, and that they had different consequences, this was very hard for the reformists in Moscow to fully understand or to put into a coherent system, essentially, to evaluate. And this is why, in the end, one of the conclusions in Moscow always was that the reforms were being blocked, that they were somehow not being implemented, that why the negative consequences were occurring in the economy was not as a result of implemented reforms, but as a result of improperly implemented or blocked reforms, because there was an inability to understand the ways that these were being implemented and coming to alternative, undesired, and very divergent consequences in parts of the USSR, and in part, I want to argue, to examples of violence, such as in Tajikistan. So I will end there. I did want to focus not so much on the narrative of the book. The book itself is very much, as Nargis very kindly said, concerned with the stories of many of the people who experienced the 1980s and the first years of the 1990s in Tajikistan. It tries to tell their stories. It tries to tell the broader macro story at the same time. But I think here what I really wanted to do is to emphasize, again, these broader trajectories that I see coming out of the book and the arguments that I think we might be able to have as a result about the Soviet collapse and its consequences as a whole. And I very much look forward to the discussion today and any questions there might be. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Laura, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I'll get started. I've actually reviewed Isaac's book before, and I enjoyed it so very much. So it's a pleasure for me to actually ask you questions in person, Isaac. But I'll ask actually different ones than I asked in the review, just to keep things interesting. And the two things that kind of struck me, I guess, as I was listening, and it was more than just two things, but are the two questions that I'm going to ask. And the first of which is, how is this period now remembered in contemporary Tajik's lives? Because I'm curious how the Civil War has impacted memory of the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And we all know that, like, the levels of nostalgia for the Soviet Union are actually quite high in Tajikistan. And I'm wondering how much of this violence is glossed over just because of the impact of the Civil War that followed and resulted from the economic reforms and challenges that you mentioned. So I'm curious about that. And the other question that strikes me is how much the story is a Tajik one, or is it a Tajikistani? Because I'm wondering how different ethnic groups in the country were probably affected differently. Specifically, I'm thinking about than Tajiks or Uzbeks in the country. Did you hear me? Okay, should I ask my question again? Can you hear me now?
I caught the question in terms of say Tajik versus Tajikistan.
Yeah. So I'm wondering how. I'm wondering how the economic reforms that you mentioned and maybe the involvement in political protest was different among different ethnic groups in the country. Because I'm imagining that Armenians in the country and Russians in the country and Jews in the country reacted differently to these events and were affected differently by these events than were, let's say, Tajiks and Uzbeks. And maybe Uzbeks had a different experience than did Tajiks simply because of their national belonging. Anyway, those are my two questions to start us
off. Yeah, thank you very much, Leota. And I'm glad also to bring this back to some of the very Tajikistan-focused element of this here, to bring it back to some of the text in parts. I think I'll start with the second question first, if that's right, and then go to the first one. There is an important question here about how much of the story is about Tajikistan as a republic and how much of it has to do with Tajiks as a group of people, or within the broader ethnic breakdown of Tajikistan. And I think until 1991, it's very much Tajikistan story, so a Tajikistani story, if you want. Although the majority of the individuals who get involved, for example, in the political parties that are founded after 1989 tend to be ethnically Tajik. They're people of the majoritarian group. They identify with that majoritarian group. Some of the focus, of course, as we know, is on things like the Tajik language and giving more priority to questions of Tajik language and culture. Or, alternatively interesting, there's also the group of individuals from the Pamirs who are working to create more space for Tajik, for Pamiri within the context of Tajik and within the context of Tajikistan. So for Pamiri languages and cultures and the opportunity to, be educated in Pamiri language, for example. So we have a political party founded in the last couple of years, Ali Badakhshan, which is the Ruby of Badakhshan, by a group of Pamiri intellectuals, but they kind of situate themselves within the broader idea of Tajikness, although there is a long and laborious and somewhat frustrating argument in the last couple of years of the USSR as well about the place of the Pamiri peoples vis-a-vis the Tajik nation, and where is the proper relationship between them. So this is a very contentious issue. In fact, it becomes very politically important between January and March 1992, and part of the early conflict that then becomes violent is in fact over whether or not Badakhshan, that is to say the Pamiri eastern province, can become an autonomous republic, or whether it should remain an autonomous oblast, which then becomes a personal conflict between Safar Ali Kinjayev and Navjuvanov, the Minister of the Interior, who was Pamiri at the time. So yeah, this there is a contentiousness to some of the political movements, but they are largely positioning themselves not really as nationalist per se, but as representing the republic. And there are a number of people also of Uzbek background who are involved in some of the political parties. So, it's not exclusive. However, if we talk about non-Central Asian minorities, which is to say those of Slavic background or Caucasian background, these are people who tend to be excluded from the new political parties, right? They don't find representation there. They tend to be people who, because of their minority status in increasingly ethnicized or increasingly nationalized political environments, would align themselves with the Communist Party or would align themselves with the sort of status quo. There are also individuals who begin to leave the Republic very much after even 1990 into 1991, before the collapse of the USSR. We have outmigration. In 1992, there's a very large amount of outmigration, especially of Russians and Ukrainians. But I really also should emphasize that although there have been a number of rumors in the years since, there is no targeting of minorities and no targeting of Slavic minorities in Tajikistan during the periods of violence. Right? There is no sort of attempt to force out the Russians per se or to target them with violence. And there have been a lot of stories that have been extrapolated from and built upon, but there is no evidence whatsoever in the historical record of this occurring on any significant scale. So we have an interesting mix on the one hand that it is an increasingly Tajik story, an increasingly ethnicized story, but not one that necessarily wants to nationalize to the exclusion of other groups. But we do know that many of the other groups do leave. Whether it's a perception that violence might occur or a worry of the future, or part of a broader trend that's actually observable from the late 1970s on of renationalizing migration trends. So, people moving from non-titular national republics to their titular national republics, so to speak. So we know in the 1980s, right, there is a movement of Russians to Russia elsewhere already. And this seems to continue and be sort of accentuated afterwards. So in terms, that's only a partial question, a partial answer to the question. I think if you go into the civil war itself, it becomes a bit more complex in terms of the violence in places like Kurgan Tubeg, but again, I think that can see the trajectory more or less continuing in the same way. I did want to talk though about memory in Tajikistan today, which is also a very curious thing. overwhelmingly, the majority of people, when asked about the collapse of the USSR or the economic recession of the final years of the USSR and or examples of violence, for example, February 1990, where we have a large violent series of protests and riots and a number of people die as a result, and sadly in Dushanbe, they connect this very much as a process that goes cleanly into the Civil War. So essentially the Civil War starts in 1989. Maybe it starts in 1990, maybe it starts in 1992, but all of these things are part of one chain of events that they're referred to as sabitia, right? That they are not a civil war per se, not a collapse per se, but a series of events that continue on into the mid-90s. And there is a sense in interlocutors, especially those who might be sort of less tuned into politics in a way, that the USSR collapsed maybe in 1995. Maybe it collapsed really in 2000. There's not really a sense that the USSR is gone in 1991 because what was happening in 1991 didn't stop. And we, of course, as historians, we want to say, oh, look, December 25th, 1991, the USSR is gone. There's no more Soviet Union. But this is not lived experience. The USSR is still there for months, for years in a way. Russia remained a key player throughout the civil war in Tajikistan. I put up a picture of Yegor Gaidar in the slides, specifically because he made a clear decision in October 1992, essentially about which side to back in the Tajik civil war, and that was decisive. And Russia continued into the 2000s to be the decisive actor in Tajik security. In many ways, it remains the decisive actor in terms of Tajik state security. So where does the USSR end? Where does the collapse happen? And what this also emphasizes is that for many people in Tajikistan, the collapse itself doesn't seem that different than the Civil War. It was a period of time where things were getting worse, right? It hadn't really gotten to open warfare. They didn't hear tank shells being fired in the outskirts of Dushanbe, but life was deteriorating. It was going in a direction that was not what they expected. This is reflected in a number of memoirs that have been written about the period. It's reflected in day-to-day conversation. But I think that it also helps us to think about the broader period, not only in Tajikistan, but elsewhere, as something that's leading into the 1990s. We know the 1990s in Russia is not a pretty time as well, although thankfully not open civil war. But I wonder, as well for many Russians, how much the last years of the USSR also seem to be going in the same direction as the so-called wild 1990s. So we can try to reorient as well our temporal focus on this idea of 91 and after.
Great, thank you. Nargis, I think you have a couple questions as well.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting what you're saying, Isaac. When the Soviet Union actually collapsed, and it is still sort of, we still have the heritage with us, and the process is still ongoing. But I wonder, like, when did we see the kind of the end of a more or less functional empire? Because kind of 70s, that's a good period, right, in terms of the interest in the peripheries and all these investments going to Tajikistan, to other areas. But then 80s, there is a change, right? So there is kind of the reformatting of the empire and kind of the and loss of interest in the peripheries, right? So if Gorbachev didn't start those reforms and kind of didn't make all these mistakes and all that, I wonder where we would have been. How functional that empire would have been, kind of in the 2000s and and now, but that's very speculative. I have a question regarding, okay, so if I understood your book correctly, you talk about three kind of main factors. The first one is mismanagement of economic reforms. The second, kind of the perestroika unleashing all these energies in the society. And actually, I think you make a very good point that kind of the about Gorbachev not being very smart in kind of doing these reforms while destroying the vertical of power and unleashing all these energies, right? And third factor of Moscow's mismanagement of the political scene and kind of the very weak political agency inside the republic. And I was wondering if you have kind of a hypothesis why there was such a problem with the political leadership in Tajikistan, because I would understand that like Makamov being a weak leader, that sort of fits the pattern, right? If we look at the perestroika era kind of leaders put by Gorbachev, right? You have Kolbin in Kazakhstan, and you have Nishanov, and so not the strongest political leaders, but Nabiev being so weak, and like all these people who kind of at the top being so helpless. How do you explain that? You refer to kind of very specific political culture in the Tajik Communist Party. So I don't know if you can elaborate on that a little bit. And we welcome the questions from the audience, and actually we already started getting some really good questions. Please insert your questions, and people watching on YouTube as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nargis. I think a lot of this has to do with the particular individuals who end up in power in particular republics in the late 80s, as well as the underlying relationship of the Communist Party in a particular republic to the Central Committee in Moscow. And I would make two comparisons here. One to Turkmenistan. So Saparmurat Niyazov becomes the first secretary of the Turkmen Communist Party almost exactly at the same time Kahor Makamov becomes first secretary of the Tajik Communist Party. Niyazov's predecessor is also removed for seemingly being, too loyal to the previous unreformed order and not being interested in change. And, this is Gapurov in Turkmenistan. He had been there a long time, right? So there's this general idea of shuffling people and bringing in new cadre who are, as you say, right, meant to actually be not particularly willful. And Niyazov also is seen as somebody who is loyal to the system. He doesn't have relationships with particular power groups in Turkmenistan. He's a Russian speaker. He, is culturally and educated in Russia, etc. And he's seen as somebody who will be malleable. Makamov is the same thing. Makamov is also largely a Russian speaker. He's educated. He grew up speaking Tajik, but he had become a Russian speaker. He's very comfortable in the Russian language setting. He's an individual who you look in the archival records, even if other people are speaking Tajik, he's still speaking Russian. So Niyazov and Makamov are seen to be, the same figure for Moscow, right? They don't actually pay that much attention to the difference between republics. So, okay, we changed both of them, it's fine. But it turns out by 1989 and 1990, if you look at, for example, what Niyazov says during the Congress of People's Deputies in Moscow versus what Makamov says, Niyazov is angry. He's asking for political change. He's saying there's a recession going on. We need to do something, right? Our economic superstructure is falling apart. Turkmenistan needs more control of its resources, right? He sounds quite cogent, which is fascinating in itself. Makamov is quiet. He won't say anything. He only agrees with, he gets up to give speeches in agreement with Gorbachev. That's it. So we already have this bifurcation of roles and of activity. Now, part of this, I think, has to do with individual character. Niyazov, as it turns out, was much more interested in power in a way. Makamov, when push came to shove, was one of the people who said, okay, right, I'm not going to fight protests. I'm not going to use violence, right? He was very adverse to using violence in February 1990 and in September 1991. So, he essentially quietly left politics when push came to shove, which is very different than Niyazov. But I think this also has to do with the underlying, again, what I would call a political culture of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party in Tajikistan was a party that had been developed very much closely in coordination with Moscow. We know that in the 1930s and the 1940s, it's largely run by individuals who are sent directly from Moscow. Bobajon Ghaforov, who's one of the first sort of leaders of the party that comes up through the ranks in Tajikistan, is and becomes the first secretary. He's the first secretary for a long time. He's extremely influential. He brings a lot of investment to Tajikistan. He's also somebody who always had a very close relationship with Moscow. And we see over the decades that there is an extremely close relationship with Moscow ministries, the Moscow party, and overwhelmingly all of the individuals I talked to from the Tajik Soviet government or party were in Moscow half the time. They spent half of their time on Staraya Ploshchad. They spent half of their time sitting in Gosplan in Moscow, right? Their lives were very much integrated there. Now, I don't have the personal experience with people from Turkmenistan to say that was the case there, but I had a really fascinating series of conversations with Saulius Kurubuskakos, who's a historian of the Lithuanian Communist Party from Lithuania, who has done a huge amount of really incredible work on how Lithuania as a communist republic and the Lithuanian Communist Party interact with Moscow. And they are completely different. They don't spend any time in Moscow. They don't interact with Moscow. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They're very concerned with being Lithuanian and retaining an identity as a Lithuanian Communist Party that somehow is different than the Communist Party in Moscow. And this is absolutely not the case in Tajikistan. And I think these are the sort of differences that then come out in 1991 and 1992, because for Makamov, the idea of being an independent president just didn't make sense. And for Nabiev either, even though Nabiev is in a way a stronger figure, he had a bit more history, he had a bit more of experience in the 70s, and again, this high point of Soviet peripheral development, if you want. But when it came to the idea of running a government without Moscow somehow being the final arbiter, he did not seem to understand how to do it. And I think this comes from the integration that you see between the communist parties, the integration between the governments. And part of this has to do with the cotton monoculture, and part of it has to do with the fact that the Tajik economy was constantly dependent upon an inflow of funding to make up for the underpayments for cotton. So we have this sort of constant flow of money, which requires massaging and essentially people being in Moscow to make it work. So we can look at the structural reasons for it, but the consequence is that people are acting differently under pressure. When you finally get to the pressure moment, you get the moment where you have to run an independent state, you have to build an independent economy, when you have to avoid violence in the streets, right? Some people have essentially the experience in a system to do that. And people, sadly, like Makamov or Nabiev just did.
Yes, thank you very much. Let's take questions from the Q&A chat box.
The audience. So I thought we could actually put two of these questions together, just for the sake of time and kind of themes. And they are the two questions from the anonymous, from the two different or the same anonymous attendee. And I'll read one of them. So the first one is, one of the reviews of the book found online says the following: Scarborough's narrative leaves one wondering whether, instead of embarking on seismic reform, the Soviet Union should have remained a, quote, benevolent empire, end quote, for its poor periphery. But the book fails to answer this question. Do you agree with both assessments? That's the first question. And the second one is, there is a hypothesis that the civil war in Tajikistan was triggered by events planned and implemented by the Central KGB, which is hoping to use violence as a justification for measures against deamortization and liberalization. Have you heard of this hypothesis? And if it was not for this trigger, do you think that sooner or later the civil war would have started anyway, given the increasing economic hardship? So really the questions are related. It's, do you think that this, was there kind of been a government sponsored motive for the creation of political violence? And would it have happened anyway? And would the civil war have happened anyway? And could the Soviet Union, I guess, have prevented this? Had the reforms looked?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's a really large number of conspiracy theories about the collapse of the USSR and the causes of violence that occurred. In Tajikistan, we hear very frequently about the role of the Republican KGB in starting the riots in February 1990, supposedly in order to discredit Parastakhez and other political parties. You can also hear about, either the local Tajik security services or the central security services, which were in disarray in Moscow, also having a hand in the start of political violence in 1992. To be perfectly honest, there is absolutely no evidence of this at all. There's no evidence that the KGB had any role in initiating the February 1990 riots. There's almost no justification that would make any sense for them doing so. especially for the fact that Rostakhez or other political parties only became prominent after the riots, not before. So there was absolutely nobody to delegitimize in the eyes of the Tajik public by creating riots. There's a huge number. There's a long argument about this, and I do talk about this in the book. In terms of the civil war, I don't think it makes much sense at all for the Russian security services to foment a civil war in what they consider to be their sphere of political influence. So I'm not, again, there are reasons why we hear these stories, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's always, in many ways, politically more comfortable to blame a select group of outside individuals for internecine violence rather than to look at the causes that actually do make neighbors kill each other. It's horrifying. It's overwhelmingly not pleasant to think about what was going on in places like Kurgan Tube during the Tajik Civil War. It's really, like, it makes me depressed to think about it. It's a horrifying experience that people went through. And we don't want to think about what would actually motivate people to act in those ways. What are the social motivations? What are, the economic causes of acting in such a fashion, especially in a context like Tajikistan where things were really stable before that. So it can be easy to think of outside actors coming in and pushing the populace rather than thinking about the structural and social causes of this level of civil and internecine conflict when it does occur. Do I think the civil war would have started no matter the case? Not necessarily. Again, I think you have, in Tajikistan, as we were discussing with Ramdiz, you have a particular series of circumstances. You have an economic recession and collapse that you see everywhere. But then you have particular economic circumstances in Tajikistan. For example, the fact that their economy was even more integrated, let's say, into the Soviet superstructure and more reliant upon the Soviet economic superstructure than many other republics, that made it worse. And on top of this, then you have essentially incompetent politicians running the show, who do not know, for example, or who are not thinking about how to gain a consistent monopoly on violence, whereas their Central Asian neighbors in places like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan do so. And so this makes a real difference. So there's not necessarily an inevitable conflict or an inevitable violent war, but it's dependent upon these particular circumstances. In terms of the question about the Soviet Union as a quote unquote benevolent empire, this comes from Masha Lipman's review in Foreign Affairs. I disagree a little bit with the terms of the question. No, I don't think that I suggest that the USSR was per se benevolent. I do want to argue in my book that it was stable and that for the elites of Tajikistan, say in the 1980s, it worked. But I also emphasize very much, and I'd like to do so here, that it created a highly destructive and economically, essentially colonial cotton monoculture in the Republic, that it was not developmental for most outlying regions of the Republic in any sort of immediate sense. So I don't see the Soviet Union being a benevolent empire for Tajikistan. Certainly an empire, maybe a stable one. But my argument doesn't have to do whether or not it should have remained or didn't remain. That's not my remit as a historian. I'm arguing that it collapsed, and the collapse was highly negative for the Republic. What might have happened otherwise, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask one question? Well, you said that there are you connect all these different conflicts throughout the post-Soviet Soviet space and Soviet space. Did you find any kind of evidence of learning from each other? So they kind of, there is a movement appearing somewhere, I don't know, Popular Fronts, and kind of they in Tajikistan they were looking at what was happening in other places and learning, because I understand that they kind of the same structural factors underpin these processes, and I think you make the argument really, really nicely. But did you see any evidence of the kind of the learning process?
Thanks, Nergis. This is, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's sort of, do I see evidence of Mark Bessinger's argument? Is this like, in a way, maybe not directly, but this movement of ideas, right? So, I mean, Bessinger's book, I think, is an important touchstone for all of us who are working on the collapse of the USSR, and the idea that, you know, there was a movement of ideas of democracy or ideas of political participation eastward, essentially. And you do see chronologically, right, and there's evidence of this, that things are starting in the Baltics and in, say, European Russia, and then later it seems to be in many cases in the Caucasus or in Central Asia. And there is an interesting question about the Sayudis, for example, which were, you know, this very outspoken leading political party from 1988 on. But actually, fascinatingly, in 1988 and 1989, the KGB in Tajikistan is really worried about the Sayudis. They're very worried about the fact that, but they seem to have heard about them from Moscow and from the Baltic side of the KGB offices, and they're worried that they're going to be influential on Tajik groups. And they start looking for evidence, and they start actually making up evidence that Orastakhez is in contact with the Sayudis. But Orastakhez wasn't in contact with the Sayudis, and not until much later in 1990. And they only got in contact with the Sayudis because they needed to print a newspaper, and they were having trouble accessing a printing press in Tajikistan. So they managed, through a group of Tajikistani PhD students in Moscow, to get in contact with the Sayudis, and the Sayudis agreed to print their newspaper. So, and that was the only contact I could find between the two groups. So you don't really have a lot of direct evidence of contact. You do have the sense by 1989, curiously again in the Komsomol in Tajikistan, that other republics are more active, right? There are more informal groups. There are more groups in favor of perestroika in Russia or Ukraine or the Baltics. Why don't we have it, right? And in fact, Rubauru, which is one of the first pro-perestroika groups, if you want, that's founded in Dushanbe, is founded by the Komsomol because it decides that it needs to be an open and productive platform for these discussions about reform and change. But there hadn't been anything before that, and it's actually the Komsomol who's aware of things. So in a way, you have an awareness, but it's more tenuous than I think is often seen, and it's also driven, curiously, by state actors in many cases, rather than by the parties or individuals themselves.
Okay, and let me ask the last question. I apologize, we haven't addressed all your questions, but we have 3 minutes left. Isaac, to what extent did you rely in your book research on local secondary sources, and how do you assess scholarship by Tajik historians on this period?
That's actually a very important question. So I'm very happy to the anonymous individual who posted. I really tried, to the best of my ability, to use local secondary materials as well as primary materials. I think there is an unfortunate sometimes tendency in Soviet historiography to emphasize our work with primary materials from the region, whether Central Asia or elsewhere in the USSR, but not to privilege secondary sources as legitimate sources of knowledge. What the knowledge that's being produced in a place like Tajikistan is also worthy of the same evaluation as Western academic materials. So it's not always possible to find as much. I would say there isn't actually a great deal of academic production about the 1980s and the 1990s in Tajikistan. It's a period that's quite hard to work on academically if you are a citizen of Tajikistan, resident in Tajikistan, because it's a period the government doesn't like to talk about and is very concerned about. And often, curiously, what you'll see is that there are two types of publications produced. One are shorter form articles in newspapers. So if you read the local press in Tajikistan, you can find a large number of relatively short articles by historians and political scientists and academics, which make important claims in the historiography, which are actually doing the work of academic literature development, but in a periodic form that we wouldn't expect in the West. So I have taken those articles, those in Asia Plus, which is a Russian language newspaper, Ozodogon, which is a now no longer functional, unfortunately, Tajik language newspaper from Tajikistan, primarily, as well as a few other newspapers, and treated them essentially as academic articles because they are written by people who are making academic claims. There are also a number, I think, of quite good histories of Tajikistan written by Tajik scholars. One is a book called The History of Khatlon from the Beginning to Today. So that, I mean, that's the translation of the title, by Roy Rolivo, which I use in certain parts of the book to sort of buttress claims that I'm making as well. And these are works that are unfortunately not very well known because often they're written in Tajik and they may not be accessible to everyone outside of Tajikistan. But they are something that I've tried to incorporate as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I think we had a great discussion. Thank you so much for your book. It's a great book, and I think everybody who is studying Central Asia should really buy it. And you can get a discount if you go to the website of Cornell University Press and find Isaac's book, and where there is the coupon kind of thing, you can insert the code 09BCARD, so it will read 09B card, and you would get a 30% discount. So so with that very valuable information, let me close this session. Thank you very much, Leora, for co-moderating the event, and thank you very much, Laura Sargent, for making this possible. And we will see you next year. Thank you.